Well, hello, everyone. Good morning. Thanks so much for joining us for our Ask Me Anything on the topic of change management. We still have a few folks that are popping into the lobby here, so we're just going to give everybody just another minute or so before we get started. All right, it looks like it's calmed down. So again, thanks for joining us today. We're excited to talk to you about change management. Lots going on in the world. My name is Nicki Hibbs. I'm Chief Strategy Officer here at Beehive, and I also am a ProSci certified change management practitioner. And this is my colleague.
Hi there, I'm Renckens, and I'm a group director here at Beehive. I partner with Nicki on a lot of our change management work. So we were the pair that gets to talk to you today. This is an AMA style, as you all hopefully are aware. We do have 4 slides to kind of give some background on change management communication and kind of what we mean by it, why it's effective. And then I promise there'll be no more slides and we will dig right into the questions. We've got a handful that were actually submitted as you all registered, which is great. But also drop them in the chat as we go, as things kind of come up, because that's where we will be spending our time today, is really talking through the questions that you all have and hopefully providing some helpful insight. So with the first little bit here, we wanted to start with just why change management communication. We know that grounding anything in data and making the case for this is always really critical to getting it prioritized within organizations. So just starting with a little bit about the effectiveness of change communication, we know that change has become really constant. And we also know that with all of that change and those shifts, those can really disrupt your organization. They can hinder engagement, and they can just be really frustrating for leaders and employees who might be experiencing some level of change fatigue. So we know that the better that we can apply change management, the more likely we are to meet project objectives. And that's really that graph there on the right, which shows that those projects that were said to have excellent project management were 7 times more likely to meet or exceed the project objectives. A super compelling stat there. We also know that CEOs are in really wide agreement here that their ability to adapt to change will be a competitive advantage kind of now and into the future. So this is an area that we know leadership is prioritizing and we know it's effective, but we need to get a little more into, okay, how do we do it really well? And when we think about change and when we think about change management, a lot of the times I think what we're all thinking about is those projects or initiatives that you see there on the right. So things like mergers and acquisitions, maybe it's a move of your office or your office setup. It could be reorgs. So all of those things that require that kind of detailed and dedicated change management, right? But I think if we all kind of take a step back, what we can also see is that there's just a lot of macro change happening on a kind of broader level. Things like political polarization, economic uncertainty. So, the numbers look good, but they don't feel good. And all your people are feeling that. There's this big push for belonging and connection, especially kind of post-COVID and post the isolation that came with the pandemic. Rapid digital transformation. So on the technology front, there's just this huge macro trend happening in the background of everything and oftentimes in the foreground of everything that we're doing that is at an accelerated pace that we haven't seen before. And that's kind of happening across personal, professional, all elements of life. So all of these big macro changes are happening in the background, but they're really driving these changes that are happening kind of more at this project level. So I think it's important to look at those kind of as related, although they are different. And I think we actually saw some questions that were submitted beforehand that we'll get into and get into this a little bit more. But I think this is an important one, this feeling of like overwhelming change, but then also these smaller changes that are happening within organizations.
So one of the things that we like about the pro side change management model is it's very focused on the people side of change. How do you get people to think, feel, and do the things that they need to do to really make the change that you're implementing effective? It takes a lot of psychology and a very strong communication focus to implement this model. So since we're going to talk about this model in a couple of our answers today, I wanted to just spend a minute or two grounding this group in what is pro-size change management model. And its shorthand is ADCAR for the obvious reasons up here. So in the A phase, in the awareness phase, the idea is that you really need to get everyone on board with why you're making the change that you are making, as well as what happens if you don't make the change. In the D phase, that is about desire to change. And that's everybody's favorite question, what's in it for me? And so as communicators, that is an opportunity for us to think about sharing benefits of the change, not just features of the change. Under knowledge, it is getting your audiences to feel really confident and comfortable saying, I know what to do. So at this point, or at this phase, what we're really doing is a lot of coaching and training, resource sharing, so that people are getting really comfortable and know what to do in the new change environment. Under ability is confidence. I can do it. I have asked my questions. I know who to ask if I'm having troubles or issues. I know where to share feedback, and I'm doing this as more a part of my day-to-day job. And then last is positive reinforcement. So this is, in some cases, business as usual, but it also is rewarding and incentivizing the behaviors and the people who are demonstrating and driving change. So if you break that down into how you would put together a communication plan, you see it builds over time. It's not kind of a one and done approach. And it gives you the opportunity to plan in advance so that you're not trying to build the communication plan or communication runway at the same time that you're trying to implement the change. So some nice features of the ADCAR model.
I think that reinforcement piece, that last R, is the one, at least in my experience, that I've seen fall off the most regularly. So I think a lot of change management communication is great kind of leading up to that point. And then the reinforcement piece, which again, isn't just like a one-time thing, but needs to keep happening over time. That's where things oftentimes get forgotten because people have other things that they need to get to do. Right. And they kind of move in different directions. But I think that's the piece when we, especially when we think about like change fatigue, I think a lot of it could come from that. It's like we have these changes, they happen, and then we like never hear about them again. Right. And they don't integrate with the other pieces of our work that we're doing. I think that's a key one that I see forgotten quite a bit.
And one thing that we can do to address that that is really beneficial is sharing out results or progress against the change. So it doesn't always have to be a kudos or an attaboy kind of a reinforcement. It can be, we've decided to make this change, we've implemented this change, and this is the progress that we're seeing and the impacts that it's having for our business or our organization. That's really meaningful too. So gives context to back to that why question, why are we making the change? One last setup slide, and then we will get to your good questions. Another pro-sci template that we reference quite frequently is the change triangle. And in order for change to be successful, it requires good project management. So that could be operations, it could be logistics, it could be implementation, but it also requires leadership and sponsorship. So at the top of the triangle, we are always looking for an executive champion for any significant change in our client organizations. It might be a subject matter expert, or it might be an executive leader, but it's always somebody who has the visibility and the credibility to really drive home the importance of why this change is necessary. And then there's the change management piece that really is the whole communication function. So whether that sits inside your organization, whether that's an agency partner or another partner, really integrating the change and making sure that there's good three-way communication between implementation, leadership and strategy, and the communication piece really are critical to success. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in some of your questions as well. All right, we are going to stop sharing slides, And we had, as Marie said, a number of questions that were submitted in advance. So we're going to start with one that goes back to the notion of sort of macro trends as well as daily business changes. So the question is, on top of daily change, there is sweeping existential change happening. AI is the example that was given in this question. So are there any tips on how to manage both streams of change at the same time?
Yeah. So I think it's actually interesting to think about these not as different streams, but maybe that one is a tributary or a side shoot off of the mainstream. And what those mainstreams are those big macro trends, right? Those things that are driving change across society, across our personal and professional lives. And then these kind of offshoots are the things that we're seeing in our organizations that need to change kind of as a result. So if you think about rolling out a new purpose and vision and values, right? That's a change that we see a lot of organizations go through. We've actually worked with a lot of clients over the last year or two that have really prioritized that work. They're not just doing that because they think it's maybe a good idea or they think it would be fun to invest their money in something like purpose, vision, and values. They're doing it because of some of these bigger macro trends we're seeing. So that shift in what people are thinking about when they think about their workplace, right? There's these increased expectations of their workplace. They're seeing it more as a part of their life, and they're reevaluating the role of work in their life. They're also looking more from a societal standpoint. People are looking more at impact over intention, right? Like, what is the impact of what organizations are doing, not just what is the lip service that they're paying X, Y, or Z. There's also that need for belonging and connection that we're seeing at a societal level that is oftentimes, linked pretty closely to DE&I. And again, those are things that are all driving that business decision, right, to adjust our purpose and vision and values.
So, customers want to do business with organizations that feel aligned, and people want to work for organizations that share their values. So those bigger macro trends really are driving then the work inside the organization to make sure everything's synced up.
Yeah. I also think it's important to think about change management as both a capability and a process. So a lot of times we think of the process. So we've got that ADKAR communications plan that is a super useful tool and really relevant for these things like mergers and acquisitions or office moves or whatever the kind of specific initiative might be. But then I think more broadly, there's change management as kind of a mindset. And that's a mindset that needs to be kind of developed with both your leaders and your employees, or else we're just going to kind of keep hitting that change fatigue over and over again. So to build that sort of competency or resiliency among leaders and across your organization, I think is the other sort of side of the coin of change management that sometimes gets forgotten or buried, that can really help with some of those bigger macro trends and shifts that we're seeing in the market. I think one last thing I would add to this is, when it comes down to it, like, you need to make decisions, right? You can't just take on all of this change and prioritize all of that within your organizations. So you have to be discerning. And the ways that we can be discerning when it comes to determining what changes we take on, like, head on, really do link back to your purpose, your vision, your values. So I think, AI was the example that was brought up here. If innovation is one of your organization's values, and that is a thing that you promise that this is part of your experience here, and it is a promise you're making your people, AI and integrating it into your work and being a leader in it probably should be at the top of your list of changes that you need to prioritize. Versus if innovation is not in your kind of mission, vision, values, are not a big part of your business strategy, maybe you get a reactive policy in place, or maybe it takes a backseat to some of the other changes that you do need to prioritize. So I think using your existing purpose, vision, and values, using your business strategy to make those decisions and help you be more discerning is the best way to kind of not try to boil the ocean with all the change you're making. And it can also help make sure that the changes you are working on are the ones that are sticking.
That matter.
Yeah. All right, Nicki, I've got one for you.
Okay.
So this next question that came in is, can you share best practices for communicating during an office move?
Oh, that's a good one.
So specifically a move in this question, it was specifically a move from a traditional office space to more of a modern open concept design.
So Beehive has actually done this work for a number of clients. There are two examples that sort of come immediately to mind. And one was bringing a number of healthcare clinics together in a modern facility all under one roof. And the other was bringing some very dispersed administrative functions together in one shared services space. So bringing everybody from all different parts of a metro area into one location. So it's an interesting question because I think what can often happen is you have a project management team, a construction team, a packing and moving team, and they all have their own set of communication experiences and needs, right? So the moving team is going to send out an email about how to pack your boxes and where to pick up your stuff and what your schedule is going to be. And then the welcome committee has communication about lunch plans on the first day and where to park and all these things. And if it's not a coordinated effort, it can feel really noisy and a little bit complicated. So one of the things that we have always recommended is identifying somebody inside your organization who is going to be the communication champion for the entire move project. So that means coordinating with your builders, with property managers, with your HR team, with moving companies, so that there is this sort of master plan in place for coordinating all of the communication and making sure it gets cascaded in a way that is helpful and meaningful to your employees and not overwhelming and confusing. This would be one of those instances where I would say that ADKAR model comes in great handy because you can start that communication process then as soon as you start communicating to your employees that there is going to be a move. Why are we making the move? What are the benefits going to be? What's in it for you? How is your work experience going to change? What are the benefits of being there? And then it gets into what do you need to know? How do I pack my boxes? What do I do about security? Where can I park? All of those things. And then in the knowledge phase, it is, I know how the technology works. We have some shared norms and cultural expectations about how we're all going to share and use the space together. And then that reinforcement is, asking for two-way communication. What's working, what's not. Making sure that you're really addressing publicly any changes that you've made based on feedback, incorporating suggestions from your team to make it a really communal and livable space. So that's kind of the big picture, because hopefully somebody on the call specifically asked about things to consider when you're moving from a more traditional office space into a more modern and open space. I think one of the biggest things to think about from a communication perspective is what kind of culture do you want to create? So whether you're picking up and moving everybody from one location to a new location or bringing people together from multiple sites under one shared roof, you don't necessarily pick up your culture and move it with you. So you want to talk about big things and little things. Big things. What is the expectation around hybrid work? Will there be hot desking so that you sit someplace fresh and new every day, or do you have dedicated space? And in my experience from the number of moves that we've done, the smallest people things can make the most noise and really derail a smooth move. And it could be things like, where are we going to store our boots? Can I bring a photo of my family or my dog to put on my desk? What are the shared expectations about who cleans up the kitchen and wipes down the microwaves? So it's really thinking through the whole user experience and having content planned, a policy and an approach planned, and communicating that in a really meaningful way and getting a lot of feedback so that people feel like they have some input and a little bit of a stake in the move themselves.
Yeah, I think it's not even just feedback. It's being part of having people across your organization be part of creating those policies when it's possible. When we moved offices, I was the head of the dog committee, for example. So I got the joy of determining what is our approach. We're in a dog-friendly building. What does that mean specifically for Beehive? What does that mean for other kinds of pets? What does it mean for like vet records that you need to submit and things like that in advance? But just those things, like it doesn't all need to be owned by one individual.
I think that's really important.
Getting other people involved across your organization, like you said, gives them a little skin in the game. and helps them feel some more ownership of the change, which helps kind of move everyone through the change a little more smoothly.
I think to the extent that you can come with a clear set of expectations, that you're not sort of trying to figure out once you're already in the space, that's ideal. And to be able to be flexible, because once you've lived in the space, things are likely to change. So continually seeking that feedback, and demonstrating that you're listening to the feedback and making adjustments appropriately, also really helpful for a successful change.
Another one for you.
Oh, for me? Okay.
For you.
All right.
Suggestions for managing negative change, such as excessive employee turnover. So what employee turnover rate is too high, strategies for communicating with my organization's decision makers about why excessive employee turnover is a problem. So lots in that question.
There is a lot in that question. I think one of the pitfalls of that change communication is quite often organizations will look to communicators to say, I need you to write the thing, share the information, have an opinion, push the email. But without strategy and understanding and action that the organization is going to take that actually sits behind that, it sort of just becomes lip service, and then communication kind of gets the bad rap for why it didn't work out the way they thought it was going to work out. So I would say in this particular situation, the first thing that I would ask is, what does communication really own in this decision? And what needs to be sort of recirculated to HR, to other leaders, to acknowledge that there's an issue and to share with the communications team. What's the approach? What do we know about the root cause, and what are we going to do about it so that communication can be really authentic and really meaningful? So assuming that part of the plan has happened, managing communication about turnover requires a lot of compassion. Because it is people. Sometimes people are leaving of their own accord, sometimes because of a reduction situation. Whatever it is, it can create a lot of noise and disruption for the folks who are staying. Questions about, will my role change? Is my job secure? Is there something going on here that I don't know about? And so from a communication perspective, being as proactive as possible in anticipating, what do you know about that change? What can you share about the why, and what can you continue to sort of work through a modified ADKAR plan? What are we going to do about it? What do you need to know about it? And continuous updates. I think that's really, really critical. There was a second part of that question as well, that if there is concern among leaders or decision makers, or and maybe a lack of understanding that the excessive turnover is actually creating a problem. And it could be a cultural problem, it could be a workflow problem, it could be a productivity problem. I think the role of communication in that instance is to be as data informed as possible. So what do you know about the rate of change? Is it comparable to what's happening in your industry, or is there something else going on there? What are the impacts that it's having on the business? Does it mean that there's reduced capacity? Does it mean that you're experiencing burnout? Is it creating a culture issue? So whatever data you can take back to leaders to really help them understand what the challenge is, and help them get back to you with thoughts on what are we really going to do about it, so that the communication back to the team is informed and authentic and actionable.
There's a comment, for those who remain after a layoff, they see how the company treated those being laid off. Do it well or risk losing workers. It's a great point.
All right. Another question that came in advance. What should PR pros be thinking about in a national federal election cycle?
What a question. What shouldn't we be thinking about? I think so. When we were talking about this, I think we thought about it in a few different ways. So from a traditional media relations standpoint, so as we think about a big election year, traditional media relations, one thing we know is that it's going to be a super competitive news cycle, right? It's going to look a little different than it looked in 2023. It's all 2023, for example. So, the news cycle is going to start a little bit earlier. It's going to last longer, and it's going to be super, super saturated. So A couple things to think about from that media relations standpoint is, one is expectation setting. So just for your own teams and for your clients especially, making sure that, you're being a good partner, whether that's internal or external, being a good partner and kind of making sure that everyone is aligned and educated on how the news cycle in a federal election year can impact all news, all media relations, even if it isn't directly related to something on the political front. That is still where our time and attention is going. So that setting expectations piece, I think, is really important. And then working with your teams or your clients to think through, what stories do we have to tell and what's actually going to be compelling? Are there ways that we can plug into the election and the big issues that people are talking about? Or are we really trying to push an agenda that just doesn't quite have that sticky relevance that we need to actually break through? But I think, overall, the media landscape and the kind of inventory that's available is just going to be less in the same way that it is for advertising at this time. I also think, so outside of those traditional media relations, making a pretty intentional plan internally, and this starts to bridge both sort of internal and external, but making that plan for what is your organization willing to speak out on, and what are you not willing to speak out on? And that's going to be different for every organization based on, again, your values and your mission and your purpose and your employee base as well. You might have employees who are kind of over-indexed and impacted by election decisions that maybe another organization doesn't, that you need to be aware of, not necessarily from an external communication standpoint, but certainly from an internal communication standpoint, how you are showing up for your employees. I think you also have to be ready to prepare all your spokespeople. So thinking through definitely the C-suite and also kind of other leaders within your organization to kind of help guide both your internal teams again and that external consumer perception. And then I think there's that AI piece that's in here, which I think it's just got its fingers everywhere. But I think one thing that we certainly know to expect, that we've already started seeing, is the rise of things like deep fakes, altered or just completely created audio and video. So just being really mindful with your communications team, what you're doing for fact checking, what trends you're hopping on or not hopping on, and making sure that you are not being part of any misinformation or fake news spreading, even if something seems super reliable. I know there's also kind of the crisis side of that, of like leadership. We've heard stories of literally like conference calls between completely fake, made up AI CFO robots that people have pieced together from webinars like this one. Using that in what seems like a live conversation with an employee, getting that employee to wire transfer some money. So it's that kind of crisis response and equipping your team with the knowledge as those things go up to be prepared for those and to respond accordingly. The last piece, which again, maybe isn't like a PR pros thing, but just for organizations in general to keep in mind for the election season, is getting your voting policy up to date and making sure that it is clear and communicated and implemented consistently. So we don't want to see like one pocket of your workers like on the floor not being able to have that time to go vote if that's your policy, but your corporate workers having that freedom. So I think making sure that policy is up to date and communicated really well to make sure that you are empowering employees to get out and vote, if that is, you're assuming that is your policy. That's an important piece as well, getting ahead of that. All right, so that gets us to our kind of pre-submitted questions, which is perfect. So I think we have about 15 minutes here to go over some of the questions that we're seeing come through in the chat. Let's see, in your experience, are companies generally considering change management seriously, or are they more short-term thinkers? You can do this one. Okay. What we've actually seen, especially recently, is a definite uptick just from our own data that we can see from our website and from other channels. We're seeing a big uptick in interest in change management communication. So I think starting probably in Q3, Q4 of last year is when we really started seeing interest really rise on this front. So from what we can see, we are definitely seeing some momentum there and some interest. Anything you'd add?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think in larger organizations that are either multinational or have multiple locations, there tends to be a little bit more preparedness around change communication, a little more formality. And organizations may actually have a preferred change management model that they like to use. So at Beehive, we like ProSci. But we have worked with organizations that use other models, Cotters, for example, and sometimes it's a hybrid. So I think, understanding whether or not your organization has a preference for change communication, for a model, for the tools and resources that you use is a really good place to start. And if you are working with a leader who maybe it doesn't have familiarity, to be able as a communicator to come in and say, there are a couple of different ways that we could approach this, and here are the benefits. So, does one of these feel better than another can be really helpful.
Nice. This is a good one. What is a CEO or president's role in addressing macro change? So internal versus external. What about the business as a voice?
That is a great question. It's always difficult to balance the role of your own personal values and your own personal beliefs with the organization that you're representing. As a C-suite leader, a CEO, a chief anything officer, president, your role in your employment situation is really to represent the business and the brand, and to do that as authentically as possible. So, thinking about company values, company mission and purpose, thinking about your own company policies and what topics or changes may have the most impact on your customers, your employees, and your partners. That is really your job. And I think the challenge for leaders is, fairly regularly to have an evaluation and do some self-reflection to say, is what I am putting forward on behalf of my company and my business truly in alignment with who I am as a human being? Because if there is dissonance there, not only can the marketplace feel it, it's not a healthy place for your leadership team to be. It can create a lot of additional conflict that really isn't necessary. The role of those leaders is to create engagement and alignment and to advance in the best interest of the business. So if it's something that isn't sitting well with you personally, might be time to just do a little self-reflection on that one.
Yeah, I feel like the role of that CEO or president can't be understated. I think it was probably the Edelman Trust Barometer that came out this year, which just continues to show that people trust and expect a lot out of the leaders of these companies.
Yeah.
Like they are the face of these brands. And when we think back to some of those macro trends, when people are expecting actual impact over just intention, a lot of that is kind of consciously or subconsciously kind of assigned to the leaders of these organizations.
Absolutely.
So the weight that they are carrying and the especially with those larger brands, the public face that they are to those external audiences and the trust that's there, it's certainly a position of power and one of very, very high expectations.
I would say a very timely example is what's happening at Boeing right now with all of the airplane safety, jet safety. Just in the last few days, we've seen a number of senior leaders step down from business leadership roles, from R&D and safety roles, because information has surfaced that the executive position or chatter on quality control and safety maybe doesn't match the public facing view. And there needs to be some accountability there. And that is to protect not only human lives of travelers, but also workers, as well as the brand reputation and the financial viability of the business. So that is a really critical role to be in alignment and take a stand.
All right, ideal state. Where does change management as a responsibility sit in an organization? I can start.
Okay. All right.
Well, I think it's going to be a little dependent, obviously, on a number of things. The organization itself, the makeup of that organization, the functions, what the change itself is. But I think if you think back to that triangle that Nicki started with, where we have some project management involved, we have communications involved, and then we have that leadership or change sponsor involved. It does take that cross-functional kind of involvement from a number of different people for us to really see success. I think one example that comes to mind with this, where it maybe falls short, is when something like DE&I efforts have been housed in HR and only HR, and just said, this is an HR issue, you guys own this and run with it, but it has no other executive sponsorship or real integration across the company. And it's seen as just sort of this box that's being checked off to the side. I think that's an example of kind of being over siloed with something that is addressing maybe one of those macro trends, which kind of led to maybe that internal initiative to get DE&I prioritized internally.
I think the change itself is probably initiated at an executive level or maybe in a project office. The communication piece really needs to be championed and owned by a dedicated communication resource. And that three-way communication and that three-way relationship, the stronger that is, the more authentic and transparent that is, the more successful the change is likely to be.
One interesting model I've seen actually that this kind of brings up is I have a client who it's like probably a 1,000 employees-ish. And they actually have kind of a not centralized, they have a cross-functional change management team. So they've got I think it's 16 individuals who have gone through ProSize training and have become certified that represent different parts of the business. So HR, communications, IT. And so at a minimum, they've got this group that has this training and can help when these changes come up, and can provide that expertise. And I think there's one person on that team who their whole role is change management within the organization. But the other 15 is just part of their role. And it's kind of one thing that they can do in addition to their kind of day-to-day work. That does, of course, cross over with their actual work and their typical roles and responsibilities. But it's kind of that change committee that is the sort of internal thought leader and starting point for any change. They're not the only people who work on any change, but they are kind of that first hub.
Yeah. I see one other one on here that I'm interested in. How about an executive leader change for a small, approximately 9-employee organization, but it's an influential nonprofit? I think that's a really interesting question for me because it brings into question not only the issue of change management internally for your employees, but also in the marketplace. So for an organization that is a nonprofit, you have donors, you have community organizations, you have partner organizations. Potentially there are government relationships in place as well. And so really thinking through who needs to know about the change at what stage and how you cascade or flow that information is really important. But again, that ADKAR model starting with why. Why is this person leaving? How much can you share about that? What are you planning to do to fill the role? And does this create opportunity or vulnerability for the organization? And how transparent do you want to be about those conversations? So it may be a little bit different depending on who you're talking to. But one thing that we always caution, particularly with a small group, is whatever you share internally has the possibility to become externally facing very, very easily. So making sure that there is good consistency there is really, really critical.
This is a good example, which leads to a good reminder that I think a lot of times when we're thinking about change management, we're very much thinking internally. We're very much thinking about our internal audiences and about our employees. That's, I think, typically how we see people approach or get attracted to change management communication is very much that internal employee piece of it. But that external piece is very real. And those external audiences and how you communicate with them. I think especially in things like higher ed, when you have a similar amount of external stakeholders that feel just as involved probably as your internal ones, and just as much part of the brand as your technical employees or current students. that wide range of kind of external, and that ad car model still applies.
Absolutely.
And still translates in the same way. All right, let's see, one more on here. Should not change management be part of an organization's culture by now?
I think we both have opinions on this. I will start. I will say, in a perfect world, yes, that would be amazing. But the simple fact of the matter is, it is not always top of mind, especially if you are hustling to do your day-to-day business. So, raising the question, encouraging the discipline, bringing that cultural expectation to the table, I think is something that the communications team or a communications leader absolutely can own. It's really part of having a seat at the table early on in strategic decisions, or when there's a big initiative taking place, and being able to have the confidence as a communicator to raise your hand and say, this is probably going to require something above and beyond our day-to-day communication. This feels bigger, different, special, challenging, whatever that sort of flag is. That's a great way for the communications team to be able to bring good strategic counsel to executive leaders and to be part of that conversation early on.
Yeah. I mean, it absolutely should. It would be ideal if it was. And I think maybe some people think it is part of their organizations because maybe they're really focused on it. But when we think about change management really being about bringing all these individuals along, change management communication, you've got people coming and going from organizations, which can change, the appetite for change. So I think it's certainly depends on the organization. We'd certainly love to see more of it be kind of the expectation and the norm, and over time, hopefully it will be. I think that covers the questions that have come in.
All right, we have just a couple minutes left if anybody wants to drop anything else in the chat. Otherwise, just a reminder that we did record this session today, and you will all be receiving a link to it this afternoon. So please feel free to share with others if you found anything useful here, forward it on. And I will also say that if there are follow-up questions, I believe that my contact information is going out with the video clip, and I am happy to hop on a quick call with any of you if there are things that we didn't address today that you'd like to talk about one-on-one.
Wonderful.
All right.
Thank you all for taking time today. Appreciate it.
Great to see you all. Thanks so much.
Bye.